As more states legalize recreational marijuana, New York and New Jersey are at least getting involved in the debate. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy supports legalization. He ran on it. He's trying to get lawmakers to sign on. Meanwhile, across the river in New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo says he's open to studying the issue, but he won't go any further than that. The Journal News has been studying the issue and looking at how arrest numbers might help frame the debate, and those numbers might surprise you. I recently sat down with health reporter David Robinson. He shared some of his findings. So, David, attitudes about marijuana legalization are changing. 60% of Americans say they support legalization. There are efforts underway in New Jersey. It's legal in Massachusetts and Vermont. And there's an effort underway in New York as well to legalize it. Yet New York State is still arresting a lot of people for marijuana possession, correct?
Definitely. There's tens of thousands of arrests that have taken place since even the state passed the medical marijuana legislation in 2014. So we're talking, we're talking tens of thousands of arrests statewide per year that kind of the data fleshes out, telling the story of, changes in reform across the country aren't really necessarily having the effect on arrest data.
The numbers are down from their peak during the stop and frisk years in New York City, but still, I mean, and it's still, New York City is number one in terms of the state in terms of arrests for possession?
Without a doubt, by a long shot. Yeah, all but 120,000 roughly of the 887,000 arrests during the past 18 years took place in New York City. So you're talking an overwhelming majority happens in New York City, and as part of that, as has been kind of fleshed out in reporting in the past, that there's a racial disparity in the people who are getting arrested.
And I'll get back into that in a second. So the numbers are down from their peak, but there's still a lot of them, and it's New York City, Yonkers, and Nassau County?
Yeah, so we broke it down by county also. So when you talk about outside of New York City, you exclude New York City, you're talking about, actually Suffern is first county-wise, then Westchester County, then Nassau. But when you break it down even further than that, we looked into the actual arresting agencies. So you look at Yonkers City PD being a majority of the Westchester County arrest. And that's part of that trend of seeing, a lot more arrests in urban centers and some of those kind of statewide themes that come across this.
And I assume the police department say that they're doing this for quality of life reasons. This is to stamp, it's what we heard back in the broken windows days, you stamp out the low-level crimes and that hopefully prevents the big-ticket crimes?
To some extent. The Yonkers PD was a little reluctant to talk about it, but they talk about kind of, going down from their peak years. So you're talking their peak years around 2014, and in the past 3 years, their numbers have really declined precipitously. You're talking about, an average of 250 arrests per year compared to a peak of 1,000 plus in just Yonkers. And they're saying that it's part of actually a focus on kind of group-based crime and repeat offenders. So it's kind of the same kind of narrative that you're hearing from the broken windows years, but in a different kind of analytic-based conversation.
And you touched on some of the racial disparities, which I think we've known about for quite some time. And just for anecdotally, a white kid on a college campus with a joint in his hand is probably going to, get a finger wag at best, whereas people of color tend to wind up getting arrested for these things a whole lot more. The numbers back that up, that there is that disparity still going?
Based on arresting agencies and location, there hasn't been a really demographic-based study in a while, but, it's some of those same themes as far as where they're happening and anecdotally, but the numbers still flesh out where they're happening, and really the most recent data from 2013 really looked into that. And when you're talking about, the differences in decriminalization, as you talked about, there's the issue of summons and violations that aren't even reflected in these numbers. There's thousands more people who are going into the criminal justice system through the summons, the violation process, and as the story that we told of a Yonkers reverend and her grandson being arrested twice on low-level possession and having to go through the criminal process itself is still part of the issue here. It's part of the issue of you're decriminalizing, but as Donna Lieberman of the NYCLU pointed out, that it's just changing the consequences. You're still putting somebody into the system, and that's kind of where the advocates are saying that you have to address it.
And the impact of being in the system once you're in, if anything else happens to you, then all of a sudden you've got a record and
exactly
gets worse.
To some extent. I mean, there's a fine process. There is, you can be expunged, but that takes a lot of effort that I think a lot of people don't have the resources to go through legally. But there's all the elements of once you get into a court, you're there. you have to deal with it.
I know that this was part of the conversation both about decriminalizing. By the way, New York State decriminalized possession in the late 70s, and you would never know that from looking at some of these numbers. But in terms of sort of turning the tide of the debate, we've known about these spikes in arrest numbers for quite some time. Is that factoring into the debate that's going on about what to do with recreational marijuana in New York?
To some extent, I think they're kind of separate issues to some extent. The idea that there's already recreational laws in other states, and so that's when you get into the people who there's an anti-recreational movement that's starting to flesh itself, starting to bubble up a little bit under the surface, especially in New Jersey. That, they're a little bit ahead of New York in their discussion, and there's a lot of pushback from groups like Smart Approaches Against Marijuana that are talking about, we better take a moment here to talk about, where this is heading. As far as legislation, when you talk about recreational, you talk about their narrative is the next big tobacco. We're talking about the quote from Ken Sabat of 50 years of lies and deceit before we realized we shouldn't have gone down this path. I mean, that's where you see the counterbalance. There's starting to be a swing back to, okay, there's larger states that are looking at this, larger population bases, and all the different lobbying groups start to get interested when there's a lot of billions of dollars at stake when you're talking about investors and you're talking about Wall Street's interest in this.
There will also be billions or millions of dollars in terms of tax revenue as well. It's funny, the rest of the country talks about how liberal New York City is and how liberal New York is, but when it comes to something like marijuana possession, definitely not among the most liberal in the country. And maybe not, and not even the most liberal among its neighbors at this point.
That's the point that Donna Lieberman pointed out, that she's talking about, for all the progressive talk, that they're still lagging behind places like New Jersey, Colorado, Washington, whatnot. David
Robinson with the Journal News and LoHUD.com. David, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And you can read David's story right now on LoHUD.com. It'll also appear in Sunday's edition of the Journal News. And want to talk with the panel a little bit about it. Full disclosure, you're a minority owner of a
cannabis company.
Okay. Full disclosure, you're not.
I'm not.
It is Tikkun Olam, but
that's right. The governor's idea to study this in New York. What's your take on that?
I actually think that's a very good approach. I think many of us, myself particularly, have reservations about how legalizing should be structured. How do you minimize the negative impacts which you could have? I think the language of legalization matters. I hate to be technical, but I thought it did in medical marijuana. I thought we didn't do the best job we could in making it available where appropriate. So I think you have to actually study it and see what the impact is.
But it is legal in like 9 states now, and it's been legal in some of those states for a few years. Isn't that enough of a template to provide the information that a study would provide?
No, I think that's exactly what you do. You go back and look at the states that have had it. You look at impact on, for example, student performance, which is something that does concern me. Students smoking dope,
I mean, we're talking about adult use. We're always only talking about adult use. And part of the issue here is we have to stop the stigmatization of something that's been used in states legally for years without any of all those horror stories coming to fruition. There is one other practical matter, $450 million of expected revenue. $450 million for the MTA, for our schools, which otherwise will end up going to Vermont or going to New Jersey.
Although with that as an argument, you could use that to rationalize almost any vice that you wanted to.
Yeah, let's have full casino at
I'm
Yonkers
sorry,
Raceway.
we do have actually casinos that are
No,
opening, and
I know,
we are
but-
moving down that road, so we have already accounted for that revenue.
Well, no, there could be more revenue. I just happen to be sensitive since Yonkers Raceway is in my district, but that we could have a full casino there and pour in
Well,
more
I know
revenue.
you would never ever allow that to happen.
I do support that.
Oh, well, I'm sure you'll make it happen.
That's the revenue. But no, my point is, I agree. I think revenue is a factor. I think it's fine to do it. I think this is a complex area. I don't think we did medical marijuana right. And I think that's a good lesson of how you don't do it right. And I think we should look at it.
You have 400
the
people.
world will not end.
You have 400 people sitting in New York jails tonight only because there's a stigma around the use of cannabis.
We got a minute left. Dominic, I know you oppose legalization. How do you respond then to the racial disparity when it comes to marijuana arrest numbers, particularly in New York and other places too? Somebody who looks like you far more likely to be sitting in jail because of holding a joint on their person than somebody who looks like me is likely.
No doubt about it. And so I'm torn because at one time I was a young African American male, many years ago, and so it's true. And oftentimes law enforcement will use marijuana to justify stopping you and going even further. Mm-hmm. So I respect Scott's right as a businessman, because the train has already left the station. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. But I go back, I know you're short on time, to my grandmother, who did not have much of a formal education, but she had a PhD in terms of loving me. And my grandmother would always say this to me, boy, because my grandfather was a heroin addict, boy, if you start with them reefers, it's only a matter of time till you're going to go to cocaine, and then it's only a matter of time till you're going to go to heroin. So I saw my grandfather go through this. It's not cute. I don't approve of it. I see young people today in the projects that once they start smoking marijuana, they become lazy and they don't pursue their careers.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. And it's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Same with you, Scott.
Pleasure as
Same with you,
always.
Shelley. Thank you
Pleasure.
all very much. Appreciate it. Up next, three little girls take on legendary theater critic John Simon. They love the new Broadway show Frozen. Simon, not so much.